time is money. The more time you waste, the more money you can potentially lose. Don't think I shouldn't try this or I shouldn't be involved in that. Try everything.
Hello, welcome to the latest episode of Leadership Blueprint. Really excited today to be joined by Adam Malouf. A really interesting individual, originally from Australia, moved over to the Middle East in 2004, working within private equity investment management space. He was here in 2008, obviously during the financial crisis. So I think there'll be some really great insights there for us. He's also been the CIO of the Dubai Knowledge Fund. So again, some fantastic insights from real estate to investments to government organizations. And he's actually now moved back to Australia for the last about 2 years or so. And he's been the COO of Wollongong University. So I think it's going to be really interesting to see how we're looking at it from leadership within investments, leadership within government, and then taking some of those lessons back to the education sector. And again, in a different country as well. So I think it's going to be a really interesting chat with Adam today. And I hope you, the listeners, get as much out of this as I think we're going to. And yeah, Adam, thanks so much for joining us today. I think let's just start off with a quick little couple of minutes overview for the listeners that just expands a bit more on what I've said, and then we can jump into some of these key lessons that you've learned along the way, which I'm excited to explore further. So thanks again for joining us.
No, thanks, Oliver, and thanks very much for having me on today. I'm really looking forward to this discussion. So very briefly, I've got about 25 years of leadership experience, mainly being in COO and CIO roles across government, banking, funds management, real estate, private equity, and touching on different sectors as you alluded to. So education, healthcare, technology. I spent 20 years in the Gulf, based in the UAE, but working all around the region. And as you mentioned, I'm now the Chief Operating Officer for the University of Wollongong, one of the largest universities in Australia, which coincidentally has a campus in Dubai. Apart from that, I've been also a non-executive director for about 25 years. I've sat on various boards across different sectors: financial services, education, technology, healthcare, real estate as well. I currently sit on 2 fintech boards in Abu Dhabi, and also sit on a couple of advisory boards, both in the Gulf and in Australia as well. So that's a really high level about me and my background.
No, thank you for that. And I think I'd forgotten about some of the board positions. So thank you for mentioning those. And I think it's interesting as well to see within the fintech space as well. So I think we can explore some of that because, again, we have, leadership across a number of different sectors here. So as you mentioned, you've got your diverse background, across multiple investment spaces and verticals. What's been some of the biggest transformation projects then that you've worked on, and what did that mean from a people perspective? Because I think that's always a really punchy thing to start with. Change is fantastic, but how does it impact people, and what maybe pick out one or two of the biggest ones, and what were some of those key lessons learned? I think that'd be a great place to start.
Yeah, so I've seen my role in transformations in a couple of respects. Number one, I've been the executive sponsor or the key person who has ultimate responsibility for the execution and delivery of the particular transformation that we've been looking at. And so with that comes a couple of key responsibilities. Number one, it's around not only having the right team from an execution point of view and from a technical perspective, but also being able to influence the change. And when you have a myriad of stakeholders and complex interrelationships between stakeholders, that can be quite difficult. And particularly when you're working in a government or semi-government context, that overlay makes it even more complex. And part of influencing that change is very clearly enunciating what are the benefits that key stakeholders will see once this transformation is completed. I find that people are looking at this change proposal in the sense of what's in it for me? How's it going to make my day-to-day work life easier. And that sounds quite simple, but that's what it boils down to. I mean, human nature is very simple when you look at it in those terms. So that's on the people side. The other side of my responsibility in terms of these transformations has been, I don't want to call it lobbying, but I guess it is. It's lobbying at board or governing body level and getting the board to understand, number one, why we're doing this. Number two, also what are the benefits and how does that link back to the organization's strategic objectives? And three, how are how are you going to properly manage the expenditure associated with this transformation, particularly around large scale digital transformations? So, and there's some of the responsibilities that I see in my position as being critical. Some of the challenges are around not only managing expectations of people, but also if you do the transformation in the right way, you want to involve stakeholders in the journey of that transformation. And what that means is, for example, getting them involved in a number of consultative sessions, workshops, looking through each part of the change process, looking, at a very granular level at the various processes and procedures that are going to be changed, streamlined, made more efficient, or in some cases eradicated altogether, and how that's going to feed into system enhancements. Because if you don't get that buy-in at an early stage, then you'll foist the system upon people and they won't use it. It would have been a complete waste of time and money. But in involving people in that way, you've got to balance that with their day-to-day BAU responsibilities, which can be quite difficult. So you've got to be cognizant of that as well, and that's one of the challenges that I've faced in delivering large-scale, particularly digital transformations, because just at the end of the day, you still have a functioning business to run. I mean, the transformation project sits alongside that. So that's one of some of the challenges that I've faced. Probably a good example of a major overhaul is in the human capital space. So this was an overhaul of an Oracle based system for human capital management. It had been used in a very limited fashion in the organization, but mainly that was supplanted by using manual processes and procedures, which wasn't effective at all. And the reason it hadn't worked was, as I alluded to before, you've got to look at the underlying business requirements, the processes, procedures, which drive the way that the system can deliver, a relatively high degree of automation. The problem was they tried to put the system in place thinking that was going to solve the problem, whereas they didn't actually look at what the business needed. And the critical path of the project was based on that. And I said, well, this is not going to work. And this is why it hasn't worked in the past. But they've been trying for 7 years to do this transformation. That's why it hadn't worked. So straight away, I went to the board and said, listen, this is what we need to do to make this work. Yes, the cost will be X, but what we're going to do in terms of making sure the critical path of the project is logical will mean that this will more than justify the cost that we're looking to spend up front and the ongoing maintenance and upkeep costs. And so we spent probably 3-4 months just doing that, right? Taking a pause. And sometimes you have to take a pause. There's always this rush. There's always the urge from people to say, oh, look at this new shiny system, or look at that new shiny system. It's not about systems, it's about business requirements. And that's what you always have to keep in mind fundamentally, is it's all about business requirements. The system is an enabler. That's all it is.
Yeah.
But with the system, you have to make sure that, you don't ordinarily have a situation where you have something which is out of the box, off the shelf. You will need some enhancements, refinements, customization. But the idea is for that to be minimal. It's when you start to over customize that it becomes cost ineffective, and you may as well build the system from scratch, which you don't want to do, basically. So there's some of that's a good example of a particular system transformation.
And I suppose, you know, the key takeaway there very much sounds like it's effectively your ability to ask the right questions to uncover the root cause and then story tell the solution. And I mean that's the bit which I think I always find interesting when you know different people, you know, come on the podcast and talk. It's how did they effectively communicate that story to get that buy-in? And I think, you know, as you've said there, it's getting people to take a pause. It's getting people to say, well, what is the cost versus the time versus the benefit? You know, where's that sweet spot? Somewhere in the middle. And I think, you know, it's you know, we have that, you know, with some of our own innovations and so on. That there's a point where you go, is that last 10% actually worth all the time and the effort, or is it 90% going to be absolutely fantastic and the last 10% is maybe not as shiny as we wanted, but the sheer amount of time and effort and investment to get that last 10% actually may not be of any benefit longer term. So yeah, it's interesting. I mean, like, what would be really good to explore is, so you've done this in governmental, you've done this from boards, you've done this with fintech, you've done this in education. Does the approach, the story, or the questions asked to uncover the root cause, let's say, does it dramatically change, or is it just the language because the problem's slightly different?
The principles don't dramatically change, Oliver. What does change is you have to adjust the tenor and the complexity of your message based on the level of awareness and education that you're dealing with board members, with, you know, fellow senior leadership colleagues, and with, you know, people within the teams that are going to be impacted. So, you know, particularly at board level, you may have some directors who are very literate from a technology perspective, very literate from a financial perspective, but others are more generalist. And it's those ones who, you know, it's not their subject matter expertise, where you have to take them on the journey and focus your effort more on explaining to them how this works, you know, from first principles if necessary, taking them through step by step in a very logical manner, how this is going to benefit the organization, not so much from a dollar or dirham or real perspective, but yeah, you look at it in terms of return on investment. Return on investment is not always quantifiable. And you have to look at also the qualitative benefits as well, because that's sometimes all you can do. It's not always easy or possible to quantify it in you know, hard financial terms, but the principles are the same. You know, what's the root cause of the problem? What does this business need now and, you know, 5, 6, 7 years into the future? And how user friendly and how configurable and reconfigurable is this piece of kit? Because, you know, requirements change. You want to know that if you don't, you know, install a module today, that you can bolt it on tomorrow, and that transition process will be seamless. So it's also looking forward, you know, what your requirements are going to be, which can be challenging, but insofar as it's possible, you need to go through that exercise. And I think that's important, to be able to understand and work backwards or reverse engineer what you need to do now to allow that to happen.
There a specific methodology that you work through, and has that again been adapted depending on the audience, or is it more bespoke? There's a set of principles that we're trying to get towards, so actually the approach changes notably each time. Do you get what I mean? Is there a set framework you try and stick to in small adjustments, or is it, you know what, I know where we've got to get to, but I need to approach it very differently depending on the audience each time?
Well, I think they're two separate conversations. I mean, the one thing is defining the issue or the problem you're trying to solve for, and those general principles are probably applicable in most scenarios, with some adjustments, as I said, based on level of knowledge. But then looking at current versus future state, and doing that effectively gap analysis, that's the second part of the equation. And in that regard, it's very similar in terms of the questions that you ask. How do you balance time to execution, the time required of people, and what's the cost associated with that? What are the financial constraints? And as I said, defining what the return on investment is in quantitative and qualitative terms. And that all forms part of the business case that will go up to the board or the relevant board subcommittee. So the methodology is fairly structured in that regard. There's just a bit of tinkering around the edges depending on who your audience is.
And the audience is probably, it's great you finished on literally saying the word audience. That's pretty much taking me into, so your audience has been from human capital, your audience has been from financial, from investments, digital transformation, people, culture. With that different audience, what's your fundamental how are you adapting to those different environments when you're having to understand their problem and then deliver that message? Because we have talked a lot about, yes, there's a structure, and yes, it does adapt depending on the audience. Can you give us like an example of saying, if I did this project, so we mentioned there the Oracle one. So when we approach the Oracle project with human capital, we would go in XYZ way. When we've done something within, let's say, digital transformation or investments, we've done it, ABC way. I think it'd be really interesting to see how it would sort of change with two sort of live examples at opposite ends of the spectrum.
Yeah, I think, look, it changes. Yes, depending, as you said, depending on your audience, but also it depends on, the outlook of the audience that you're dealing with. Some of these stakeholders, call them, are very short-termism in their approach. They're worried about the next budget cycle. Some take a longer term view and aren't as worried about the financial impact. They're more concerned around what this is going to do to streamline the way in which the organization operates, and what's the ultimate benefit of, or number of benefits of doing that. And so it depends on ultimately the backgrounds of the people that you're dealing with, and what they're biased towards focusing on. And that's tricky because you're not always dealing with people who are finance, you're not always dealing with people who are technology, you're dealing with a combination of people who come at it from different perspectives. And so you just have to be able to, and this happens over time, mind you. You can't walk into your first board meeting and know how this is going to work. And this is important because it means that you need to really focus on building relationships with each of these stakeholders and knowing individually and collectively how to pitch your message so that you're getting cut through with everyone. And that doesn't happen, as I said, straight away. That may take 6, 12, 18 months. Hopefully not longer than 12 months, but it takes time. But you have to put the effort in to do that, because once you do that, you're then getting into a rhythm which allows you, whether you're talking about an investment strategy or you're talking about an Oracle upgrade to a human capital management system, it then allows you to set the tone of your message, knowing the character of the stakeholders you're dealing with. And that's you need to invest time in that more than anything initially.
Okay. And so from your transformation projects, your leadership in terms of direct leadership of individuals, what are some of the lessons that you've learned from managing those different functions, but then also managing people in different countries and then across the different sectors of your career? I think, has there been, you know, as we've said, the message to certain job functions, the message to people in other locations, and then the messaging when I've been in different parts of my career, in different sectors itself, has that sort of evolved over time? Has it stuck to certain key principles? Just be great to explore some of those. How have you kind of built that culture and shared that message with the teams that you've managed throughout your career?
Yeah. See, organizations operate across different geographies mainly because they're looking at scaling for growth. And yes, it's about bespoke opportunities, but normally they go and, market entry happens because there is a particular significant opportunity which justifies you investing resources and time in that. It starts out like that, but then once you're in market, that then opens up a whole new world of other opportunities, and it starts to feed on itself. And that's generally the thesis around, why companies operate in different markets. Now, it's challenging, depending on where an organization started its life, to be able to get your disparate parts of the business globally to operate with a common set of principles, because the way you operate in Australia is different to the UAE, it's different to France, it's different to the US. You might think that there are similarities, which there are, but there are some nuances. There are a number of nuances and differences in approach. And so, you have to be mindful. One principle I've always stuck by is be mindful of local cultural sensitivities, but recognize that there comes a point where you need to be decisive in terms of the decisions you make and how that benefits the organization as a whole. And that's an education and awareness process which you have to go through with, different geographical parts of the organization. But having said that, then you need to have a common set of principles. And, a lot of those are around, key, ethical and moral considerations around, accountability, transparency, integrity, honesty. These cut across they should cut across all geographies and all sectors if you want the organization to run smoothly and cohesively. Otherwise, even in the most challenging, emerging market or frontier market, you're going to encounter difficulties. And you have to stick to those principles with a degree of flexibility, as I said, for cultural sensitivities. But when it crosses from cultural sensitivity into areas which are, potentially reprehensible, that's a different story.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I suppose that leads us quite nicely into, if we take, say, Dubai Knowledge Fund when you were the CIO, how there were you able to build that investment strategy whilst taking into account, risk, reward, risk and returns, and ultimately, I'm sure, a number of different individuals having a number of different ideas as to what they expected from the fund and the outcomes. And so you're having to listen to a number of different inputs and then kind of put a nice story and filter on top and, manage that at the end. Could you sort of expand on that? I think that'd be really interesting to just, I think, get a bit of an insight into.
Look, the first step in that process is, obviously to know and get your head around very clearly what the strategic objectives are for the organization. What are they looking to achieve as an entity, and how does that fit in with the overall macroeconomic agenda of the emirate and the country? So that's step one. Step two is to say, okay, I, as an investment professional, know what we need to do or what we should do in constructing a sustainable investment portfolio to achieve those objectives. However, before you take that step, you need to understand from the organization's governing body, which is the board, what's their risk appetite for going down that route, assuming that that's the right route to go down, and that's what the conventional wisdom supports. Because unless you get buy-in in that context, whatever you think is right will never get buy-in. And so it's understanding what their risk appetite is, what their tolerances are, what their pain points are. Do they understand it? Okay? Because going back to my point before, there are different levels of literacy in different areas if you look across the individual collective experience of board members. And so what do you need to do to make adjustments for knowledge and awareness so that when they do come to make a decision that they're fully informed? And so I spent a lot of time on that process, that journey. And where we got to was, which is typical for many government organizations, is that it's relatively conservative. And I said, okay, that's fine. But based on that, this is what I can deliver for you. This is what it looks like, right? And that was how we were able to construct not only a cogent investment strategy, but an acceptable investment strategy. And the risk reward discussion was quite a lengthy one because they're looking for low risk, high return. But the risk reward equation doesn't work always in that manner. And how do you balance that? And the balance is not something which is set and forget. It's a constant, dynamic, very delicate process to ensure that you're meeting those return requirements, B, you are within tolerances, but C, also, we didn't do this in absolute terms. Set up a portfolio which generates X% per annum, compounded over however many years. This was set up to provide funding for education initiatives, an endowment style fund. And some of these initiatives ran over multiple years, in some cases up to 20 years. And so it was a constant discussion, constant reconfiguration of the portfolio to ensure that expenditure milestones for these initiatives were met. And going back to my previous point before around sort of current versus future state, trying to project or forecast what the requirements will be 5 years from now, and then working backwards, that was a requirement, but it was also challenging as well, because with investment portfolios, the reconfigurations don't always have an impact immediately, right? And it's also ensuring that not only the return profile is correct, the liquidity profile is correct too. Not having the right balance of product to make sure that you have sufficient liquidity that you can tap, on 30, 60 days notice. So that's also important as well. It's not just the absolute returns, it's the liquidity capability built within the portfolio.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And okay, so at the moment you've moved back to Australia. You've gone. You're now in the specifically the education sector. I suppose I'm always intrigued to know you've gone from real estate, you've got investments, we've now got education. Firstly, kind of on a personal note, kind of what prompted some of those moves from a what enticed you for the challenge? Because I think it's always interesting to see someone's drivers, and then also to understand from a leadership standpoint, have you been able to take some of those leadership lessons from those different sectors across to make you stronger, and or is it almost yes, there's a few underlying principles, but I'm almost starting again because I'm learning a different sector and actually it's a different way of doing this, and so yes, ABC core principle, but everything else is thrown out the window. It's a bit of an interesting one to delve into.
So I got a taste of the education sector in a couple of respects before this role. Number one, through the Dubai Government Knowledge Fund, through the work that we did with partners in the education space, whether that was in higher education, K-12, early learning, vocational education. So I was exposed in that context. Secondly, even before I was in this role, I was sitting on the external advisory board for the University of Wollongong in Dubai. So that also gave me a taste of the sector. One of the drivers for me taking this role was I was told up front that this would be very challenging. I was told up front that there would be systemic issues that I would have to deal with. I was told up front that this would not be easy. I said, okay, where do I sign? So, yeah, yeah. I've always had that mindset that I'm not going in to do something because it's easy, and we don't take these positions because they're easy. We take them because there's something to be done. There's a mountain to climb, and we're going to climb it. And that's what drove me to take this. Now, as it turns out, the sector overall has become more and more challenging for various reasons, mainly related to um, changes in government policy. And there are similar issues, interestingly, um, in Canada, in the UK, to a lesser extent in the US. But bottom line was I took it because it was a challenge. There were areas that needed to be reviewed and cleaned up. And I was brought in because I was someone who could bring a fresh perspective. I wasn't an academic. I hadn't worked directly in the sector, but I'd had exposure to a number of other sectors from an operational perspective and had picked up a series of learnings which I could then apply to an organization like a university. I mean, universities are very complex organizations. They have very intricate funding models, and they are, yes, a social good, but at the end of the day, they are entrusted with public money. And so there's a high level of fiduciary and fiscal responsibility that goes with managing these organizations. I mean, they have multi-billion-dollar balance sheets.
Yeah.
Normally, in most cases, bar a few exceptions, funded 95% plus by public money. But the amount of wastage and inefficiency generally across the sector is astounding. And so that was the challenge that was, as I said, the principal driver for me.
Okay. So looking back, and this sounds almost like an end of career question, but it's definitely not the end of your career. But to date, what's been probably the most important life lesson that you've learned that's most applicable for different locations, that's most applicable across different sectors? What's been that sort of overriding life lesson that's always been there as it's just a constant for yourself?
The one lesson is that you have to remember it's all about people. Everything we do touches on people. And you have to appeal to people's sensibilities, their needs, their aspiration. I know it sounds cliche, but it's the fundamentals. It's not about systems, not about processes, not about product. It's about people. Because without those, without that key element, then everything else means nothing. You have to know what motivates people, what motivates teams, how they interact, because that's how you get the best out of an organization. So, the one life lesson is it's always about people. And that's why, particularly in this role, I have focused reasonably heavily on ensuring that the people and culture team are effectively the beacon of the organization, the one part of the organization that people can turn to. And that's essential. It's really fundamental.
It's great to hear you say that, because I think it's such an obvious statement, but I think it's one that is lost on people. And it's when you ask CEOs, what is your most important customer? What's the most important part of your business? They'll say, oh, my customers, but it's their people that deliver the product to the customers. And I think it is always interesting to see someone that looks at it from that angle. Because like you said, you're solving someone's problem, you're helping someone grow, you're delivering that service, and that's internal and external. So I think there is it's great to hear you say that. And I think this is also where things like AI will be the good and the bad, because I think there's this, it shouldn't be removing people from a process, it should be enabling them to do other processes. Now it should be enabling them to do some upskilling, some retraining, some redirection. But I think there are some people that look at it as a replacement. And I think that's the scary part of AI, is the people that have that sort of mindset versus the ones that say, how can we make more efficient our processes? How can we give people more time to do more fun stuff, because we're going to take a few things off their plate, or we're going to think about things in a different way and then approach problems in a more refreshing way, and therefore come up with better solutions that ultimately the internal person's more motivated and the external person gets a better product. So hopefully everyone can stray more towards the second option than the first. But it is interesting to hear people sort of talk through some of that. And I think that takes me a little bit into, you mentioned there you're sat on fintech boards, you've done some digital transformations before. Just taking those two, I know they're not exactly the same, but tech being more at the forefront of those two areas. What are your considerations, and how are you able to keep people at the forefront of those roles and those changes that you're driving? Because obviously people can be scared of change. It's about the storytelling, which we've discussed. But how do you drive change, bring in something like fintech, but then still make sure that people are the key around that? What's been some of your approaches on those things?
Look, the approaches are pretty simple. And a lot of it is to do with constant but effective communication, so that people feel like that they're reaching the conclusions themselves. They don't feel like they're having a message shoved down their throat. And that's important because we all need to reconcile and accept the way that our own personal journey is going, or the way in which an organization is going, that we need to do that ourselves to be able to actually move in that direction. And so for me, the same applies when you're going through a significant, particularly digital transformation, which, whether it's AI driven or not, may affect the way in which the organization is structured and resourced. And it may mean impacts on people's livelihoods. But you have to, as insofar as it's possible, anticipate that. And so you're delivering a message which says that this is how this is going to benefit you. This is not how it's going to threaten you. Right? And AI has been around for a long time. It's not a new phenomenon, but it's obviously coming to the fore now because the digital firepower which underpins it has increased at a rapid rate. Literally yesterday, I was walking through a data center, right? Which is the underpinning infrastructure for this whole revolution, right?
Yeah.
And the irony around it is that it doesn't function without people. Right? That's the irony around it. It doesn't function without people. Okay? And so what that means is that you're giving the message that life will be different for you professionally, and it will be different to what you know now, and will never be the same. But this is how it's going to be better, right? Yeah, in an educational context, there's this fear that people will lose their jobs because ChatGPT or some variation thereof is going to do everything. Or in an investment context, there are algorithms that are now being written which can make investment decisions and in real time, in nanosecond. But in both those cases, the human element is still required. The human element is still required to check the course content that ChatGPT has written. The human element is required to actually hit go on the execution of the trade that the algorithm has come up with. So in both cases, and with any of these types of transformations, it's around how can human ingenuity be used more effectively, and how can it be freed up to focus on more, let's say, value add activities. Where you're using someone's full potential, not just using them for data entry, for example. That's the real question.
Yeah, and I mean that goes back to the bit I was saying is, if we can use it to unlock more potential, all the better for it. And let's see where the journey goes, I think is the phrase.
Yeah.
So looking at Australia and the Middle East, there are obvious differences, but what are some of the? I'm always intrigued to know what are some of the business practices and what are some of the leadership practices that work there is in Australia and not in the Middle East, or vice versa, work in the Middle East and not in Australia. Is there one or two you can share? I think it's always interesting, like, doing this in Australia would be, everyone would love it. Doing this in the Middle East, it's a no-go, and vice versa. I think they're always kind of informative, but sometimes almost enlightening and sometimes even a bit funny. I think it'd be interesting to see some of these.
Yeah. So in the Middle East, everything you do is very blatantly driven by relationships and trust. Particularly, I mean, trust is a given, but particularly by relationships. Yeah. You have to invest time to build relationships. You can't just expect things to happen and you haven't gone through that process. And the line between, professional and personal is often blurred in a good way, because there is that intertwining of business and social, which is very common and which is cultural, and I know that as someone who is of that heritage, that's very normal. Okay. What I've found in Australia is that yes, you have relationships. Yes, you have to trust people, but it's relatively more transactional. Yeah. It's a case of, well, I will engage with this person or counterparty only for X or only for Y. Whereas in the Middle East, it doesn't work that way. And you can build relationships here and it helps, but when you build relationships over in the Middle East, once you get to a point where there is inherent trust and there is a very strong rapport, you can do virtually anything. You can, because you've already gone through the process of getting to know someone and vice versa. And so there is that connection, which is essential. And as I said, which is cultural as well. Here it's just not like that. And it just doesn't really work in that way.
It's interesting. And I think it's probably what makes the Middle East so different and appealing. I think, obviously I've lived here a long time, and I think there is something very different about when you go back home and visit the UK and things, there is a different feel to it. So I do know what you mean. Whether that's personal or professional, it is very different. It's interesting. So career to date, 25 years and still going, as we've said. What's kind of kept you motivated, and what's kept you motivated and driving forward? Now we touched a little bit on, sign on the dotted line for turnarounds and change, and is it just that desire to try and make something better, or is there some underlying cause or root, or is it deeper seated than that? I'm always intrigued. What is your driver? What's kept you going, and what gets you out of bed in the morning for, I want to be achieving X, Y, Z. This is what my goals are.
Look, it's really simple. For me, it's about affecting change, not for the sake of it, but to deliver better outcomes. Better outcomes for customers and clients, better outcomes for the industry that you're working in, and better outcomes for the country. And I sincerely felt that, particularly when I was working in Dubai with government, because you are very close to understanding what the macroeconomic agenda is and what it actually is trying to achieve. It's a little bit more opaque here, which is interesting, but definitely in the UAE, you very clearly understood what you did, how it fit into the overall picture. And I think that's also important, not only in a a country or an emirate or a state or a provincial sense, but in an organizational sense. You know, people have to understand how what they do fits into the overall equation. Yeah. And so for me, it was always rewarding and fulfilling because you know that the outcomes that you were delivering, what the impact would be. And you knew it very clearly. It wasn't um, uh, it wasn't opaque or there was no conjecture about it. It was very clear. And that's what principally drives me.
Yeah, and I think what you're alluding to there is the why. You know, the why do people do what they do, and is that conveyed in the right way? And I think it's businesses that do well and individuals that do well, they're generally very good at explaining the why. You know, I'm motivated for this. Let me tell you about it, and let me tell you about it in a really clear, concise way. And I'm going to make you come on that journey with me. And I think that's you see that a lot with entrepreneurs, founders, CEOs, etc. People are buying into the why we're doing this, and I think that's it's refreshing to hear you say that stuff as well. Okay, so while I could chat to you all day long, I will start to sort of move towards the end of wrapping this up. So if we were to sort of say, if you had a message for, you know, the audience, this could be one key takeaway, it could be one, two, three, from future leaders, you know, what are some of what would be a key life lesson that they should sort of work towards? For people of, you know, youngsters of tomorrow, what are maybe some of the key things that you've learned? You know, looking back, if someone had told me this back in the day, you know, I'd have loved to have heard that. You know, I know it's, you know, with age comes wisdom, as the old phrase goes, but you know, specifically a kind of that side, and then if there's maybe another message, you know, up to yourself on, you know, for people that are already there that are my peers. I really found that when I started doing this on a day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month basis, even as an experienced professional, you know, it 10x to my output. It helped me achieve things to the next level. Do you have kind of one, two, three sort of
Yep.
takeaways for people?
Yep. So in no order of preference or priority.
Mm.
You know, first one is be kind. You're dealing with people, as I said, and people have different motivations, different aspirations, um, different skills, and they come from, you know, different backgrounds and sets of experiences. So, you know, be kind and sensitive. I think two, be decisive. Not everyone will admit it, but people crave leadership. I mean, I know within first month or two of my role with the university, because I could see some very clear issues that needed to be resolved quickly, I just made decisions. I mean, that's why we are in these positions. And frankly, that's why we're paid to be in these positions. We're paid to make decisions.
Yeah.
Right? Take calculated risks. Yeah, but make sure that's overlaid with being properly informed. So make the decision and get on with it. Because, you know, I know it sounds also cliche, time is money. And the more time you waste, the more money you can or you can potentially lose. So that's another point. And I think related to that is also, you know, I've always adopted the 80-20 rule.
Mm.
You're never going to get the perfect widget. It's a fantasy. You just won't. As long as you've got most of it right, you can refine the rest later. And yeah, whether that's a decision to enter into a contract, whether that's the rollout of a product, it doesn't matter. Yeah, you've got the vast majority there. You've got a suitable, adequate structure. You figure out the rest can be figured out later. That's even if it needs to be figured out. Sometimes there's this myth that, you know, that 20% remaining is critical, and sometimes you figure out, well, actually it wasn't. So that's also related to being decisive. What I would also, another key lesson is, don't, and this is particularly if I go back to sort of early career days, don't limit yourself and don't think, I shouldn't try this or I shouldn't be involved in that. Try everything.
Yeah.
You'll quickly figure out what you enjoy and what you don't. And that's actually another good point. You have to enjoy what you do. You have to be, it's even better if you're passionate about it, right? But you at least have to enjoy what you do. And that was, you know, part of the motivation for me going into education, is that I actually enjoyed it. I enjoyed it. You could see the impact directly on, students, from a teaching and learning point of view. And also you could see the impact on society from the research that, was being generated. But you could apply your skills and experience from other sectors to make the place function more efficiently and effectively. So, but you have to enjoy what you do. And otherwise, it becomes burdensome, and that's not what you want, not a situation you want to be in.
Yeah, absolutely. And it goes back to the passion, goes back to the why, goes back to the ability to tell the story, goes back to that ability to give that extra 10% yourself, to ask those few extra questions, to really get to the root cause, to then actually build the product that is the right solution, the right investment strategy, the right thing that's going to get to, the board, the CEO, the individuals bought into what you're trying to do. So yeah, I completely agree on that one. And changing of career, I started out as a mechanical engineer for the Ministry of Defence as a civil servant. Somehow I'm now doing this. So yeah, I think there's a lot to be said about definitely trying. But I think also being able to look inside yourself and say, but I need to do something different now. I mean, that's definitely try, but know when to change and
the other,
to find the passion. Yeah.
And I think the other point is, and that's related to just what you said, is around self-reflection.
Yeah.
You have to take the time to reflect on yourself, to make time for yourself, because if you don't do that, then you're no good to anyone. Yeah.
100%. 100%. We said, you got to be passionate about it, but people go to work to make some money, to provide for your family, and ultimately you want to spend some time with your family. So reflect, do the right stuff. Yes, be committed to your job, but have that time to yourself, time with the family. Yeah, sometimes you want to kill them, but overall we love them to bits. So
yeah, and also reflect professionally. Am I doing things in the right way?
Yeah.
Does what I do still get me out of bed in the morning?
Yeah.
Does it make me tick? As I said, this sounds simple, but you have to, at various intervals, actually stop and ask yourself those questions, just as a sense check, if nothing else.
Yeah, no, 100%. I think over the maybe more than this, but definitely over the last 5 years, it's been really nice to see that society as a whole has started to understand that the realm of psychology, reflection, talking things through actually has a very big part to play. Age, background, nationality, any of those things, everyone needs to be able to have that reflection, have that ability to know you're in a where is your safe space to go talk and to talk to people, to reflect. Yeah, really, really critical. And whether that's a peer, whether that's a mentor, whether that's a full-blown psychologist, whatever it is, I think people need to have that. And yeah, it's a great one to, I think, finish on. Is I think everyone needs to find that Zen moment for themselves, because it really does help on the reflection piece. It really does therefore help on your output, and ultimately, part of why we do these sessions is, yes, it's great to talk to people like Adam, but ultimately it's trying to give a bit of a message back to you, the audience, to say, these are things where you can, make a bit of a difference. These are things that will benefit you. Again, from a quick 1 second pitch, go to the JOH Partners website, our psychometric tab. There are 9 different psychometrics that are free for anyone to take, and they are from burnout prevention to leadership style to ready to be promoted to career development. And these are just things where we're trying to say to people, have a plan and try and execute it and try and live your best life, and have some fun along the way. So on that note, it's been a heck of a lot of fun today, Adam. I've really enjoyed it. Thanks so much for your time. I know you're going to be back here in Dubai soon, so we'll definitely catch up in person again when you're back. And apart from that, thanks so much for today. And have a great one. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Oliver. Really enjoyed it. Appreciate it.
Thanks, man. Cheers.